All right. So for this episode, there's a couple of things that we wanted to cover, and they both feed into each other. Basically, let's see. Early in the week, I was injured, lower back injury, and there's some interesting things.
Yeah, lower
that's
back
happened.
pain.
Lower back pain. Difference between pain and injury. Yeah. Slap myself. So that's something. That was an interesting way we're managing that. So that'd be good to talk about, and that's led into because it was around whether I should deadlift or not. That's led into obviously you saying that you have a lot of feedback on people seeing your athletes deadlifting big loads with rounded backs and what that means. People basically saying there's a high risk of injury there and that's bad technique and all that stuff. So I thought in this podcast we could discuss basically the nature of lower back pain and talk about that deadlift technique and why that's bullshit, basically.
So is it like we've had two things come up, which is you had experienced a little bit of back pain, went through a few things, and you're feeling a little bit better. So maybe let's address that as the example first. So you messaged me about a little bit of back pain.
Yeah. So just so everyone is aware what happened, it was squat day. You know what? It wasn't squat day. I was doing my it was squat technique work actually. So it was, let's see, I did it when basically it was a pretty low load, but basically it was normal speed eccentric, then 5 seconds sat in the hole, and then a normal speed concentric. And what happened was when I dropped into the hole, I felt a bit of a twinge. Now, I'd just done 2 sets of 4 second eccentric, 4 second concentric squats. And then it's hard to remember how it happened, but I feel like I dropped into the hole on the next lift pretty fast. But anyway, I felt a little bit of a twinge, either side of my spine on the lower back, right down at the bottom. I still managed to do the lift and it was fine. Managed to do the rest of the session, but then the next day, completely kind of stiffened up, and it felt kind of like, you know, when you pinch a nerve or something like that. Anytime I turned, it was an issue. So I obviously messaged you because the next day I was supposed to be doing heavy deadlifting, and in my head, the classic kind of bro science theory is lower back pain, deadlift, don't do it, right? Because the deadlift causes lower back pain, is what a lot of people think, and that's not true, is it?
Deadlifts can be used, and this is a little bit, to some people, a little bit weird or counterintuitive, because we say we generally, not straight away, but in most cases, we treat back pain with deadlifts.
Right, and this is the mind-blowing thing, because I would have ordinarily completely avoided that session. I probably would have completely avoided doing anything for about a week or two until it felt better, until I felt zero pain, and then I would have gone back into it. What I actually found was, which I told you before, which blew my mind a little bit, not only did I lift to full capacity, I pushed my numbers, so I made progress that week. There was no pain whatsoever, and weirdly, after the session, my back felt fine.
There are many perspectives to take on this. So when I say we treat back pain with deadlifts, normally I mean that in a sense where someone has actually caused an injury and then rehabilitate and return to lifting through deadlifts, usually, and through other exercises as well. In your case, you had back pain from where you moved, and it is a little bit more common with like doing pause squats or eccentrics. The reason we put it in there is to teach you to be a little bit tighter. So there's a momentary loss of tightness. All right, you've aggravated or went through spine movement, or which McGill puts it as micro movements of the spine.
Yep.
which can cause aggravation of disc or sciatic nerve, and usually the response from the body is to spasm or tighten up. Now, in that case, usually the method is to look at their lifting technique and address that, which is essentially what you did. You focused on bracing a little bit better,
Yep.
and you were completely fine, right?
Yeah. So, bit of background on me. When I first kind of reached out to you to help me, it was because I was unable to deadlift. I had a significant history of what I now realize is deadlifting poorly, bad technique, and that resulting in consistent lower back and hamstring stiffness, and just constant pain, basically, to the point where I just didn't deadlift. And I came to you and basically was like, how do I fix that? And you did a 20-minute session with me on my technique, and I've been deadlifting ever since, and it's been awesome. So you already fixed those technique issues before. I just kind of was ultra focused on them when I did my session, because I was obviously aware, can't get this wrong.
So it is. I think we need to narrow this conversation to looking at back pain in the deadlift.
Yep.
Because back injury and rehabilitation from back injury, or diagnosing back injury compared to having back pain, are two very, very big topics. And so I think this conversation, as I see it, might be confusing between the two. So
Right.
when we start to discuss this, or when we're discussing this now, we're going to talk about back pain.
Yes.
Not a back injury. And because the process to getting someone back to lifting and to deadlifting is very different that way than this approach. Now, when someone comes to me with back pain, right, I mean, there are a few tests. I test whether they have injuries or not. There's ways, simple tests, moving through flexion, extension, and adding load can all help determine what kind of intolerances we have, and then gives us a direction about what kind of injury we're dealing with based off the sensitivity of that movement and some of the symptoms and feelings and how they may feel. So then the treatment for that would be different. Now, when we're looking at pain, if they pass all those tests and they have back pain, and most of the time people I say they have back pain, 90% of the time is to poor lifting. It's mechanical. Yep. So if we talk about the topic on deadlift and back pain, and then also the rounded back issue, which people... again, is a same thing. It's a complicated topic. There's, a rounded back can be dangerous. It's to what degree and what part and how it's done. And so this is where the answer to it is just it depends on what. It depends on anatomy. It depends on the skill of the athlete. The many things, and we can discuss that.
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed. Since we've started doing this, when I see other people lifting, I pay a lot more attention to the mechanics because I'm obviously more knowledgeable there. Now, what I've seen from people lifting really, 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 like we're talking elite level deadlifts, okay? A lot of them round the back. A lot of them do it. And these people are shifting ridiculous amounts of weight, and they're not getting injured. So what's the difference there? How come they're allowed to do that?
Think of here's a great analogy from Stuart McGill, which is the spine specialist in the world.
Yep.
The greatest spine specialist in this world. And essentially look at the spine as a bit like how a bridge is built. So you have the columns of the bridge, all right? And then you have all the cables that support that column. Okay? Think of the column as your spine, okay? They have to build the column so that the force along the column is equal on both sides. We have a compressive force,
Yep.
okay? If we have it on a slight, right angle, if we have a right angle on it, then we're clearly going to create a shear force on one side of the column, okay? So you can think of this as a bit like the spine. When we applied load, which is the bridge is heavy. It's got to support the cars that are going across. We have to create a compressive force. Now, this turns out that our spine handles these compressive forces better in flexion, meaning that a slight rounded spine. Now, that is I get the anatomical explanation that we are in flexion, and flexion is generally considered what we would say rounded, but in this case it's not, it's still neutral. Now, we have a natural curvature of the spine. We generally start to slightly remove that curvature so we're able to handle compressive forces. If we try to lift in our natural curvature of the spine, which is you can consider almost slight extension, we will create a shear force on the spine. Okay, so meaning that one side of the spine is taking more load than the other.
Right, and that was my previous technique. Just because I'd overheard once that the extension of the spine is the most stable. Like, I don't actually know where I heard that, but I've heard it going around a little bit. Like, that curve of the spine.
It's a range. So there is a range of flexion and a range of extension that is okay. Until someone gets super elite, then we generally find more and more perfection. But we still got to have that margin of movement that the person may be able to tolerate. So coming back to the analogy of the bridge is that we have to create a position of the spine that handles compressive forces. The second part is that you can think of the guide wires of that bridge as our muscles. They have to create equal tension across the spine, and they got to have tension. If we don't have tension, all right, the movement of having the barbell and gravity and our body moving is going to cause the column to move out of place.
Yep.
So we use the muscles to create tension, or the guide wires to create tension on all the reason. Now, you can think of that as that there are guide wires across every vertebrae. Okay, so we have all the intricate muscles, the intraspinali, the multifidus muscle, they're all the supporting structures of the spine. So they support the spine in itself. Then you have the macro muscles, the bigger muscles. I guess you can see the big guide wires like the lat and transverse abdominis, and even glutes play a big role in trying to support that. So you can think of one of the biggest supporters in that is actually, I would say, is both the core as a whole in itself, to create a stabilizing force across the lumbar, and then you have the lat, which then creates the stabilizing force across the spine, across the top of the spine. So the lat creates the continuity between the shoulder joint and through to the hip, as the lat connects to what's called the thoracolumbar fascia in the spine, which the force then can transfer more force transfer more effectively across the spine, across the fascia, across through the spine, and then through to the glutes, which then allows the transfer of forces from the glutes to the bar and the bar to the glutes. So you can think of it as it's like a big sling that comes from the shoulder to the opposite side of the glute. And so, in all those factors, when you put all those into perspective, you end up having a lumbar spine that is actually quite flat. And for some people, we can increase that range to be able to handle it they may be able to handle those forces slightly better in slight flexion. Where flexion becomes bad is where we go through flexion movement, meaning that if we've created a position in the deadlift that is, say, within the neutral range, and then we deadlift and we go through movement under load, meaning that we start to increase flexion as we deadlift, that is dangerous. Okay, to handle load, we must have a rigid spine. Okay, it can be rounded if it's rigid to a degree and doesn't move, but if it moves, it's dangerous.
Right. Okay. Okay. This is great. So, what you're saying is, as long as that spine stays rigid throughout the compound movement, okay, the role of the spine in the deadlift, and you would say the squat, is to be stable for the transfer of force,
Yes.
right? which is why obviously we put so much stock into bracing and creating that tension. What you're saying is it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but like what position the spine is in isn't as relevant as whether the spine moves under load. Is that what you're saying?
Say that again.
So whether it's slightly flexed, slightly in extension, as long as it doesn't move with under load.
In some cases.
Yeah. Okay.
In some cases. So if you're new, focus on trying to maintain within a neutral range, which is generally, there's a range. So if it generally looks the lumbar looks flat, we're generally in an okay position. If there's slight extension, it's fine. Generally, I avoid all flexion of the lumbar spine, even for the most advanced athlete. Now, this also comes down to mechanics. If they have a longer torso, we'll look at going through more thoracic flexion, which can handle flexion far better than the lumbar can. And we use that to basically reduce the moment arm or reduce the length of the torso so that the distance between the line of action, which is where is the line that the bar travels, and that to the hip. Now, if their torso is too long, the center of mass is going to deviate forward. And so we can shorten that by reducing the moment by going through slight flexion. And now that's the actual position. So we can't increase that slightly more than what we should, but how bench press technique is taught is actually slight flexion of the thoracic spine.
Right.
So that is protraction, which means pulling the shoulder forward, and then going through depression, which then helps contract the lat and stabilize that force between the shoulder and the glutes. We don't handle that load very well in retraction, because generally we just don't quite have enough strength. So we utilize the passive forces, or the passive tension of the body, which is like which will be the sacrolumbar fascia is one part of it. So that we utilize that to try and gain tension in that position, which is far stronger. If you actually test, there was research on how much comparing passive tension and active tension. In the bottom of the deadlift, 40% of the power is coming from passive tension or passive structures.
Oh, interesting.
And at the top is 100% active. So to get the most out of the deadlift, we need to be utilizing these passive structures, which is, the protraction of the shoulder, so shoulder forward and down, which is different than what everyone's taught, which is shoulders back and down.
So I was going to say that. So the general one, and this is where the lack of specificity to the movement really hurts people. When you just have your standard kind of fitness trainer, your PT, the go-to position is extension of the spine and shoulders back, right? And that also makes sense to me. That is why you focus, when you've coached me, at the top of the deadlift. That's when you really have to work on the clench and pulling the shoulders down, and there's more.
That should be all the time. But maybe that's something specific I worked on with you.
Yeah. Basically, I at the top of my deadlift, I had, if I remember rightly, I basically yanked back at the top. Mm-hmm. I completely lost all my form when I got to the top of my deadlift because my technique was fogged basically. But all right, so let's go back to. So that explains why if people watch some of your athletes doing heavy deadlifts, that there is a slight rounding of the lower back there, but the key point is that spine is completely stable and there's no movement there, therefore making it safe.
If they have a torso length that ends up putting them more prone to lumbar flexion, I'll try and put as much as that through the thoracic if their lumbar still goes into flexion, then we'll allow the knees to drive a little bit more forward. Now, this is again another controversial topic about knee position or shin position of the deadlift. Is that I want to try and keep it in as close to vertical as the anatomy allows, but there will be knee flexion depending on the length of their femur and torso. Reason being is that is the most efficient position to generate a vertical upward force, and the best position that takes advantage of all the passive structures of the body, as well as the perfect length tension relationship of the hamstring. So it is the strongest possible position, but doesn't mean we can't all do it. So the argument is that people would say that it goes, you have to have knees over the butt. It's like, yeah, some people do, and some people get very, very strong doing so, but they're not going to be world-class deadlifters. Look at any world-class deadlifter. They either inevitably end or start in a vertical shin position. If you use Eddie Hall's deadlift, for example, the biggest deadlift in the world, or even Hapthor, they initiate the lift off the floor in a vertical shin position. They may not start there during their prep, but many people don't.
Yeah, and this is the concept of the knees over toes thing. That is something that I've also noticed as well. If you actually look at the biggest lifts, even people who say they don't train for that technique to have the vertical shins, when they're doing their biggest lifts, that invariably their shins are almost vertical, right? That's just the way it is. They just without training revert to the most efficient way to lift the weight, which is how they're able to do it.
Yeah,
pretty much.
There's a lot of arguments to it. Is that you got to have knees over toes, and that that it's more of a coordinated movement of hip extension and knee extension. But I disagree. Okay, it's not a squat; it's a hinge.
Right. Okay. So this is an interesting point because this is something you told me when you were fixing my deadlift. Is that I was squatting the bar off the ground, and there's a difference between deadlifting and squatting the bar off the ground. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, pretty much. And it just doesn't hold up because it doesn't hold up to the science. So the thing is that this is just how people have deadlifted for a long time, and they've stuck to the idea, and just that, I guess, confirmation bias is that they'll find ways to make that idea true. But the science both doesn't hold up, nor experimental or observationally doesn't hold up that we have to have the knees over the toes. It actually shows both the science and observation shows that optimal, and that's the key word, optimal deadlift is done in a vertical shin position. The changes in knee position or shin position is fine because like a lot of my lifters have to have the knees over their toes as well. But that's due to anatomy. So when it comes to maximal deadlift, anatomy matters. It matters a lot, and that determines what your technique's going to look like. You can still gain advantage of all those passive structures and length tension and all of this stuff, if you have knees over the toes, because it just comes down to your anatomy, the length of your torso, the length of your femur. They're the two main variables in this equation.
Cool. So, and that's, I mean, that's a theme that's ongoing, and everything we talk about is the role of a coach. It's not one size fits all. Everybody's different, therefore everybody's technique needs to be different. So what about going back to treating back pain with the deadlift? So that from you, you're the first person I've heard that from. I mean, to be fair, Dr. Lott said it. Everyone on this podcast would agree, but Dr. Lott said it as well. Why did my back pain... It's almost like me heavy deadlifting fixed my back pain. It's weird.
So for you, treating back pain with deadlift isn't the same logic as I normally would do. That just means you were lifting poorly before and you're lifting better now. Okay? So your issue was mechanical. Okay, so you basically you said you focused on bracing, so that reduced the amount of shear forces you experience at the spine. our center of mass resides around L4, L5, which is generally where we experience most of the shear forces. So that's where we have to, especially be extremely tight, extremely rigid, so that those force don't turn into shear force across the vertebrae. Because if that happens, we are going to get movement of the vertebrae, which then is going to create either aggravation or some sort of damage to the disc over time, and that can also then cause some of the sciatica pain that some people experience as well. However, you don't have passive damage. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to do that. You have a mechanical issue. So, treating pain happens in three stages. There's addressing the passive damage of the structure. Then there is then looking at the weak muscles that are supposed to do their job to support that passive weak structure. And then there is the neurological, which we could just call movement. How on the macro scale, how the mechanics work. Okay, because the underlying foundation of mechanics is neurological. So we kind of focus on neurological and mechanical together. So your issue is just coming from the mechanical. Okay, you will also then have some sort of maybe muscular weakness, but you don't have any passive structure. You don't have any of the symptoms or signs of actual back injury, just that you're having pain compensation.
Right, and I mean, just for everybody listening, another thing that differentiates me to most of the people listening to this podcast, or if you're coaches, the people you work with, my deadlift wouldn't even qualify as a warm up for most of the athletes you work with. So I'm obviously at the low end of amateur, right? So it's different for me in practice than how you would apply all of this to your athletes. I think that's important to say. Like, I'm one step away from general gym goer. Like, I'm just starting the powerlifting journey. So when it comes to elite athletes, obviously you go through a much different process, right? Like, it's much different.
It's yes and no.
Yeah.
Like most, the method's the same across the board.
Okay.
It's usually the individual's commitment that usually comes down to how different it's going to be, and their goals may allow for more extreme approaches, but essentially the method I apply is exactly the same. I have to work within the limits that the individual gives me. Okay, so you have various constraints. We all do, and but I mean, a lot of athletes at the absolute top are going to remove as many constraints as possible so they can train. It is completely normal for a powerlifter to train 15 to 20 hours a week, especially coming to prep, and we got to have very little constraints. I'm talking about the people at the top. A lot of the people who I might give the same amount of volume to a beginner will do it in 45 minutes. But you want to take that to hundreds of kilos, then it's going to take longer.
Yep.
And then there's normally a lot of other things we're dealing with if more advanced we get. But the process is always the same. It rarely changes. And that method, even with the deadlift and back pain, it's the same. The way you approach me will be no different than another athlete approaches me, and the questions and line of questioning I do and the way I test it is exactly the same. It doesn't change.
Okay, so one other thing that I'm interested in this. So I have quite a pronounced anterior pelvic tilt, right? Now, that means I naturally round the bottom of my back. Like, if I stand up straight, I've got a bit of a significant round in the lower back, naturally. Does that make me more prone to those lower back injuries?
Not at all.
At all? Okay.
Not at all. You just have, again, you train you train what fits best your anatomy and your mechanics. Excessive movements of the pelvis can can cause pain, especially if we're going into outside the normal ranges that we may consider as safe. You know, people are going to have some anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. And if you go into posterior pelvic tilt, we have that is flexion, technically flexion of the spine. But if we still maintain a neutral position into a pelvic tilt, then, you know, generally it's still considered quite safe. Generally, we try to remove as much of the anterior pelvic tilt initially in the squat. But again, there's a range. It doesn't have to be perfect, as long as it's safe. The level of perfection we may take does depend on I would say, I guess, how strong they would start to want to be.
Yeah. Okay.
It's relatively safe, but if I want someone with a 400 kilo squat, if you watch them squat, they're not going to have any anterior or posterior pelvic tilt. And if they do, generally, that may increase the risk of pain they may feel.
Right. So let's talk about just quickly talk about the different mentalities you would take to that client. If you've got somebody who, say they're squatting 250, right? Let's say a male squatting 250. They come to you, their goal is 400. I want to reach, they're aiming for, we're talking 1,000 plus totals here. Do you then put more work at the start into fixing those things in the beginning, or do you just get them lifting as heavy as possible?
Again, the method doesn't change at all. I'm always working to perfection from the start, from day one. It's a perfection that you'll never attain, okay? Yep. And how much focus you put on that depends on their training phases. If they've worked with me from 0 kilos to 250, they're already at a certain level of skill. And if they want to go to 400, that will just keep going. It doesn't change. It's not you have a 350 kilo squat. It's like, I like to make a difference to my squat now. It's like, no, for you to get there, you've had to work through to being more and more perfect. Perfection being something unattainable, let's say. Very few people have an absolutely perfect squat. The more elite you get, though, the more perfect it does start to become, because you're slowly working closer and closer to that end goal of perfection.
Yeah.
So that starts from day one. Okay. So basically, you give them. I train people to a level of say we call safety or functional safety, so that in that training phase they're able to attain a certain level, and then once they have attained that certain level, we then again come to the next phase, pull back, create more efficiency, and then express that strength again. The problem is that if you sit there and try and be perfect all the time, you never get strong, because getting strong is risky business. It's a risky game. So you improve the technique to a part where they're able to increase strength. We increase that strength, pull back, increase that level of perfection more. I'm saying it's going to be perfect. Just increase that perfection more, so that we're able to tolerate the next increase in load.
So you basically consolidate the gains you've made in another phase where you work on the technique to deal with that new bar you've kind of pushed.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
And then sometimes, and those phases have to get longer and longer. So if you try to keep the same method, if they want to get up to, say, 300, it's like going 300 kilo plus squat, right? Those phases are going to have to be 6, 8, 12 months long.
Yep.
Where individual, from a beginner, probably can have those phases in 8, 12-week phases.
Yep. And
they start to go 12 to 6-week phases, and 12 to 16 to 20-week phases, until when you get really elite, then, if you don't, and this is where they start not putting in the work, where I start seeing people getting strong and getting hurt, is because they're not putting in the work for a year long, which is what's required. To make change at more advanced takes longer. Changes in skill and technique takes more work, and it's very slow, very incrementally. So every session they're making a tiny adjustment towards greater and greater perfection.
Yep.
And normally every cycle we have a very specific goal in the way the technique is going to develop. And so where I can just tell someone straight away and they make changes over a few sessions, very quickly, in in say 4 weeks, they've attained a whole new skill. Where an advanced athlete is going to take much, much longer. We're normally just trying to squeeze another millimeter more, or change in direction, or increase range of motion, or change what position their finger is on the bar and relative to the ring on the bar. You know, it's like it's just very, 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 very tiny changes to greater perfection. And those acclimation of tiny changes allow them to express more and more strength.
Yep.
But no, the method for someone who comes to me with a 250 kilo squat one to go to 400, nothing changes. If I was linearly working towards 400, there's no lazy way to get to 400 or advanced way. There's only one way.
Right. Okay. That's an interesting point to make. Like if somebody's right, so you don't not change the process because it's the best way to do it. That's the only way to get there safely. Is basically what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean there are a few. Again, there's always one.
There's outliers.
There's always 1%ers. There's plenty of them, but not really. You know, because most people I deal with aren't that 1%.
Yeah.
You know, but yes, some people can just get there. You know.
Right. Okay. So just to sum up. Okay. So firstly, as always, I've been reminded there is a difference between pain and injury. A significant difference between pain and injury, and when it comes to pain, that can mostly be mitigated by correcting technique and movements, which in my case is what I've done, and that's what I originally did with my deadlift. As soon as I started doing it properly, magically pain disappears. Right. The second thing is you can't broad stroke every movement with this is how it should be done. Because, obviously this applies directly to the rounding of the lower back in the deadlift or any other movement for that point, because as you've always said throughout every single one of these podcasts, the best coaches basically coach based off the anatomy of the human being they're dealing with specifically. It's all specific. You can't just say the deadlift shouldn't be done this way, the squat shouldn't be done that way. It depends on the human being doing the movement.
Yeah, and I think one last point I want to put is that to finish this up, that my disclaimer: I'm not a physio. I'm not an exercise physiologist. I'm a powerlifting coach.
Yep.
Who has studied a lot. My field and expertise is mostly in biomechanics. My anatomy is not perfect, but I do know a fair bit of anatomy and how that applies into biomechanics. So, you know, if there are things that aren't slightly perfect, I mean, that's okay. I mean, let me know. But, because I got pulled up on this a little bit, essentially, when we had that same discussion with the anatomy behind the foot, our conclusions were the same. We disagreed on hardly anything.
Yep.
If not anything, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is probably a whole nother conversation we need to have another time. I think on another podcast. But what you're saying there is there's a whole discussion around the importance of coaches learning and upskilling in areas related to their core function. And the other point, I guess the point you're making there is you are a powerlifting coach. Your job is to get that athlete lifting the most they physically can at that moment, at that time. And you obviously rope in biomechanical principles into that. That's not the same as being a specialist. You know enough that you need to know to apply it to what you are trying to achieve.
Yep. Very, very multidisciplinary field of research to attain that high level of strength, and a lot of that I've had to research a lot on injury management, simply because a lot of physios do a really piss poor job at handling athletes. So there are very only specialized physios who actually have learned to work with athletes are the only ones I can trust to get to do the job. I know enough to get people through 98% of issues that occur from lifting, but there are always a few percent where I cannot figure it out, and that's when I refer off.
Yeah, and obviously your circle of associates that you feed this information off, we are talking like Dr. Locke and people like that who are genuinely world class specialists, which is important to make. I feel like there's another podcast here in for coaches about what you need to add to your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so that's, I would say, people are going to understand what their scope of practice is.
Yeah.
You know, mine is to make people strong. And where it starts to move outside of that, I do make the client aware that they should maybe seek outside advice. The common one is actually like within nutrition. Is a common, you know, I'm not here to deal with people's eating disorder, though to some degree we're going to have a form of disordered eating.
Yeah.
If that affects it so much that you're unable to do a diet effectively and requires counseling and specialist nutritional advice and interventions, that is not my field. Though I have done the research in it to be able to recognize those issues and know when to refer off, because it requires a level of attention that I can't give unless, you know, you want to do 2-3 hours of work with me, which then obviously is expensive. But I'm not even the expert in that field either. So it's best just referring off. Again, it's not knowing just enough to get people strong. I know a lot in a lot of fields. You just got to know the limitations on where those limitations are for the athlete, regardless of whether I know how to do it or not. I should be able to refer off.
Cool.